Okay guys, don't know if you can see too well, but right down in that location down in there, see if I can get it in the light. You can see there's a capacitor been removed right down in there. That's location C117. Now it looks like a medium-sized capacitor could go in that place, but I have seen smaller or even larger capacitors go over a part where it's screen printed and looks like a different size. As long as you get the correct values, you're okay. Well, I just removed the capacitor from that location, and this is the capacitor, and what came out of there, it had been replaced before. You could tell on the bottom of the chassis that somebody had desoldered and put this one back in, so it had failed at one point in time. Well, what they put back in there is a 250 volt 22 UF capacitor, and you can see the ratings on there, 250 volt 22 UF, and it looks like it kind of fits physically in that area, but on Bob Roberts' list it's listed as a 10 UF 50 volt capacitor, and this is the one in the kit that should be replacing this. Now let me just show you the difference in size of these capacitors. This is actually 10 UF 63 volts, and you know, higher voltage is fine, and that's what he's got in the kit to replace the 10 UF 50 volt that's supposed to be in that position. But look at this monster that was in its place. This is a 250 volt 22 UF. And I guess the chassis was operating with it, but there is no need for that capacitor to be in that location. And I've just confirmed by looking at a schematic in the Wells Gardner manual for a U5000, and I just pulled it up on my computer in the next room, and it confirms 10 UF 50 volt is supposed to be in location C117. And well, I didn't actually, I found the location on the schematic, but then they have a parts list right after it, and it confirms that part should be 10 UF 50 volts. So we're going to go with what Bob Roberts sent in the kit and replace it. That could have possibly been causing some kind of problems with his chassis before, but we're going to go ahead and replace it, and just hopefully the technician before us maybe thought he had a different chassis on his hands, because if you look on that list for the K7400 and K7500, it does list in that specific location, C117, to put a 22 UF, but it's only 63 volt. This is a 22 UF 250 volt. So it could be possible a technician thought he had a K7400, K7500, but you know, he should know better, because I don't think those come with, you know, dual res, and this is dual res. You know, you can flip this jumper out and back and you can get 15 kilohertz standard resolution, or the position it's in now, which is for medium resolution. So anyway, we're going to replace it with the one Bob Roberts sent in the kit. And also I have opted not to go ahead and replace the flyback transformer at this moment, because it is so much easier to flip this chassis out and back and do these capacitors while the flyback's not in the way with all its wires hanging off. So we're going to wait and do that last. But since the last clip, I've replaced, I think, this capacitor, and I think that's the only one before I came to this one that I'm doing now currently. So we'll continue on. Okay guys, I'm looking at a location here on the chassis I just removed a capacitor from, and it's this area right here. There's one large capacitor goes in right here, and you cannot see the designation for which capacitor it is because it's covered up with this white gunk. And when you're changing out capacitors on chassis, you'll find out that that is to be the case lots of times. Sometimes you'll get lucky, for instance, on this capacitor here, the white goop's on this side, and the designation for the capacitor C107 is on the opposite side, so you can read it easily. But sometimes you actually have to scrape that gunk out before removing a capacitor to find out if that's the one that you're wanting to change out from your list or not. Well, on this one, I haven't scraped it off yet. I am going to scrape it off and show you the difference in just a second. I know the designation is at the bottom of this screen printing right here, so it's right down here somewhere. But I already knew that this was capacitor C6, I think 14. Let me look on my list. I think it's C616 most likely. Yeah, that's right. The one right beside there is C615, and that gave me a good indication of which one this one would be. And also on the list, it's very similar in the value ratings for the one that I took out of that location. The one I took out of that location right here is a 1500 UF, 1500 microfarad, 35 volt. Now that's what came from the factories on these chassis, but if you look up a schematics on it, and take a look at Wells Gardner. I think it's in the original schematics or one of the parts lists. It actually lists this one. One of them listed as 1,000 UF, and another one listed as 1,500 UF. I can't remember which one. It's either the schematic and the parts list lists it as 1,000 UF, or a service manual lists it as 1,500 UF. It's one or the other, vice versa. And Bob Roberts' cap kit here, it actually puts that cap replacement value at 2,200 UF. And we're just going to go ahead and go with what Bob has provided us with and put the 2,200 UF in there. I looked online, and this chassis at that location, there's a lot of discrepancies, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,200 UF. So it seems like for some reason this capacitor, it doesn't matter. It looks like as long as you're over 1,000 UF and you're at about 35 volts, it'll be okay. So people have claimed they've had 1,000, 1,500, and 2,200 UF at that location. So I'm just going to go ahead and trust Bob and put that one in at this location. I'll come back in just a second and show you the designation for the capacitor after I've scratched that white goop off. Okay, I don't know how good you guys can see it, but that is designation C616 right below my finger there. The C's been slightly scratched off as I was doing that, and a little bit of the one in the middle. And it's pretty hard to get that stuff off sometimes. That gunk it's really pretty tough, some of it. I imagine you could try to melt it off or something, but you'd probably make a gooey mess. But that's enough that I know that this is the correct capacitor, C616. You can see the 616 right down there. And right beside there, see if I can get you a shot, if I can get in the light. See the capacitor right beside there is C615. It's going to blur up on me, hold on. C615, and this one is C616. But we know we have the right capacitor, so we're going to put this one in place now. And you know, if you can't find a designation and you see some of that goop around the bottom of a capacitor, just try scratching some of it off and you'll probably be able to find the designation, just in case you're not sure. Okay guys, we got a capacitor that had some lifted traces. Right here's one leg of a capacitor coming through, and here's the other one right here. This one wasn't too bad. It actually had two holes down at the bottom. It had this one and this one right up behind it. And the pad right here that this leg extends through was slightly lifting, but it continued on to this one and it was still attached pretty good. So I just carefully desoldered the old capacitor, tried to remove some of the old solder, slid this through and resoldered it carefully without trying to put too much more heat on this pad. Now this one down here on this leg, it only had one hole to extend any legs down through, and I didn't try to desolder it much because it was really lifting pretty bad. When I pulled the capacitor out and I was heating it up, I noticed it was already lifting, and I went ahead and slid the old capacitor leg down in there and just tried to maybe move around the solder a little bit and get a little bit on my soldering iron to remove some of the old solder, and I added a little bit of new to it. So it doesn't look as good as I'd like it to, but I don't want to heat this up too much more, because if this solder pad starts lifting much more, I'm afraid it's going to break and crack right on back, right about there, and I don't want it to damage that. That trace continues on underneath this right here, which was something added from Wells Gardner on the underside of the chassis, and continues on to that point right there and that point right there. They're in the same circuit. So I tested continuity with my multimeter to those two pads and to the leg of the capacitor right here, and it still has continuity. So I'm just going to go ahead and clip my legs off here and leave it like it is and not muck with it anymore, because I don't think I can do anything to make it any better, and I sure don't want to make it worse. Just wanted to show you that. Then getting several more capacitors installed, and that was just one of them that I ran into a little bit of a problem with. Hey guys, I was just soldering in a capacitor, and I just kind of wanted to show you a little kind of a trick you can use. I've soldered these two legs of this capacitor down, you know, no problems, but I was just checking continuity to make sure that they were soldered in good. My lighting is not really good, and sometimes you want to check to make sure that you still have continuity on the capacitor leg that you just soldered onto the rest of the circuit. And sometimes it's hard to tell from the underside of the board Like I'm sitting here, this is the leg of the capacitor that I just soldered, and here's the opposite one. This one right here right now, when I use my multimeter, is showing continuity to this next point right here and to the following one after it. And sometimes it's hard to tell unless you get a magnifying glass, and then it's still hard to tell if you've actually bridged two solder pads unintentionally. You'll be getting continuity to like this solder pad and this solder pad from this capacitor leg, which happens to be the positive side of the capacitor, and you'll be like, well, did I accidentally bridge these two solder pads right here in the middle and they're really not part of the same circuit? Well, one way you can tell is by looking on the opposite side of the circuit board. Not all circuit boards are like this, but this one actually has a printing on the other side that shows basically the circuit. And if you can't tell by following the traces under here, like these dark ones here, if you can't tell by following traces like that, and some of them will be in the light areas, most of the time it's green. Like you can see this solder pad right here follows this dark green connection over to this point. If you were to check these for continuity, you get like a beep on your multimeter, and it would show that it is shorted together, you know, these 2 points, that one there and that one there. And it would continue on to any of the other ones in this dark green area like that, or even up here to that one. Now if you go up to here, you see that's actually jumping across to a different trace. So if you check continuity to that point, you wouldn't get a beep. It wouldn't be shorted to this point, this point, this point, or on down to here. But let me cut the legs off of this capacitor right quick. Should be able to do that while I'm holding the camera. Okay, there's one leg off. And you want to get pretty close, but try not to damage the solder point or the pad that you just made. Okay, so that's both our legs off of there, and that worked out just fine. We're going to flip it over and look at the actual capacitor that was soldered in. Okay, and it's this capacitor at C731. It's this black capacitor right here. And at C731 we have a 10 UF 63 volt capacitor we've just put in. It originally called for a 10 UF 50 volt. Bob included 63 volt ones in this kit, and that's fine. The original one I took out was just a 10 UF 25 volt, but you can go up in voltage with no problem. But if you take a look, this is your negative side over here, and on this side here is your positive side. Now you may not be able to see, let me see if I can get it in light where you can, but the screen printing underneath that denotes which side's the negative. You can kind of see right there on this side there's a circle screen printed underneath where the capacitor is, and on this side of the circle it's not filled in. But on the opposite side, over here on the right hand side, you can see it's black. The circle is filled in, and that means that's the negative side. On the positive side, like I said underneath, I wasn't sure if it hit the next 2 points, which if I flip it over, it'll look like it's the on the positive side, it looks like there's 2 points below it that are not connected, and they actually are. Right here, you see the 2 points above there's 2 resistors. Those 2 resistors, if you can see the green printing on the board, they show that they're connected to the positive side of that capacitor. That means they're in the same circuit. So when you test on the opposite side, you will get continuity. So you'll get like a beep if you hook your probes up to the other side and have it in the continuity mode, and that'll show you that that leg that you just soldered in is getting continuity to those next 2 resistors. Now let's say, for instance, go up 1 resistor. Let's say we were working on resistors. Now if that resistor at the top of the 3 there was reading continuity to the 2 below it nearest the capacitor, then you know that you probably have bridged 2 solder pads by accident, because if you see the green printing on top, it does not connect with the other 2 points from those other 2 resistors. It's not in the same path as the capacitor and the 2 resistors. So you would know that, you know, you had done something wrong. You need to try to desolder it or scrape between those 2 solder pads and get off some extra solder where you might have bridged the connection. But you can see all over the top of this board, everywhere something is supposed to connect to another component, it has the green printing. So it kind of makes it a little bit foolproof in case you run into a problem like that. If you can't tell from the solder side of the board, flip it over, see if it has printing like this, and it'll kind of help you judge that and figure it out. But that's just a neat trick for you. Okay guys, been going along with the capacitors as fast as I can, and I've gotten all the capacitors on the main chassis except for one. There's one remaining. If you look down through the list here, you see pretty much what I've been doing is I actually circle the capacitor number like C107, C115, C117 when I actually install them in the chassis. Make some notations out to the side in case the ones included in the kit were slightly different values than what was in the capacitor list. And then on further out here, I'll make notations like if the one that I took out, the original one, was a different UF value or voltage value, just for reference, you know. But if you look down through here, I've got all of them circled except for like the ones with X's, like for the U5000, that's not going to be installed. Those are only for the K7400 and K7500, and those two are skipped. I've installed those. Every one you see in that list right there, if you go all the way across, you see that these are for the neck board. So I haven't got to the neck board yet. That's what I'm about to do. Going on down through here, everyone circled, everyone in the list. We get down here, we have some more that are X'd out for the U2000, U5000. We don't have to install those. And there's one more at the end there that doesn't have to be installed. So the only one we have left is C716. It's a 1UF 250 volt capacitor. That's the same for all three chassis that are listed on this kit. And the location on the chassis is right there. It's actually pretty easy to get to. One thing you have to watch for, just like that little capacitor there and that little capacitor there, those small ones like that, they have a dog leg in the bottom of each capacitor leg. It's kind of like they crook it down and then it kind of comes around with like a little loop when it goes through the hole. And when you're trying to wiggle them out as you're desoldering them, sometimes they want to hang on really tight and it's kind of hard to get them to come out. Some of the larger capacitors, the legs just go straight down through the holes and they're a lot easier to pull up. And usually you would just like desolder one leg and slowly lean it, desolder the other leg and lean it back the other way, and it'll pop right out. Well, these that have a little kind of a dog leg in them, if you're not careful, they'll hang up really bad and you'll have to really put a lot of force or tension on them, and you can damage the solder pad on the bottom. If you start rocking out and back, you can actually push the solder pad up from the bottom of the solder side of the chassis, and you can make it, break the solder pad. So you have to be real careful when you get those off. Sometimes the best thing to do is to just clip the legs off flush with the bottom of the capacitor if they're sticking up maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, because sometimes they don't seat them all the way down when they're small like that. Just go ahead and use a pair of nippers like these right here, and just go ahead and just clip the legs off as flush as you can to capacitor, and the only thing that'll be left is the two legs. And when you start desoldering them, you can actually grab onto them with a small pair of needle nose like these, and just pull the leg out, even from the bottom if you can get a hold of it. And as you're desoldering it, just pull it and it'll come straight down through the bottom. And just do it carefully and you won't damage the solder pad. But we've got just this one left to go right here, C716, and I figured I'd set the camera up and just let you see the full process of me doing this last one here. So hopefully I can get that on camera and you can see it. Okay guys, here's the capacitor right here, the last one that we need to change on this chassis, and you just want to locate it on the opposite side. And sometimes it's best to look and see like where your negative stripe is. It's on this opposite side right here, and this would be your positive side, so we know it's going out and back like that. So when you look at the other side of the chassis, you know you're looking for 2 points that are out and back this way. It's pretty easy to see right here. You come down, and right here's the capacitor on this side. Right here is the 2 points. Now some chassis that I've seen, especially like the Neotechs, they will actually be completely marked on the opposite side, which makes it a lot easier to find the capacitors. But you still have to be careful, because the negative and positives that are marked on the upper side of like this chassis, sometimes they're on the bottom of the Neotech chassis, and I have found a few errors in those in the past. But just mainly to find the legs of the capacitors, the Neotechs and some others I've seen are easier. than this particular chassis. But you know, you just kind of have to be careful and you know, look for hints. Sometimes if you see a resistor soldered on the other side, you know, resistors are soldered kind of far apart, like a point here and a point here, and just look for the closest resistor to the capacitor, flip it over, and if you find 2 points far away, you know, most likely down below it is where the capacitor is going to be if they were side by side on the other side. But these are the 2 points that we need to desolder, and I hope you're seeing this. Let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit. I've got it supported on the back side with a flashlight that I have that has kind of a little handle to prop it up with, and it's got a place there that kind of holds this chassis from moving around much on me. See if I can zoom into our point here. This is where we're interested in right here. Let me adjust my camera up a little. Hopefully that's in focus. And what I like to do, got the soldering iron hot, I put my hand around on the other side, and usually just one finger will do on the capacitor, and I'm going to try to get the solder molten on one side, and I'll lean the capacitor away from the point that I'm soldering so it'll pull the leg up through the top of the chassis. So I'm getting it molded now, and I'm pulling up on it. Okay, it has completely released on the other side. You can actually see right here the capacitor. I can actually pull it over as far as I want to, but I want to leave it to where there's some room to pull on it, because what I'm going to do this time, now the capacitor has been desoldered there, that's solidified again. I can rock in the opposite direction with my finger, go against the opposite direction, and the leg that has desoldered will seat itself down against the chassis again, and you'll be able to put pressure against it and it'll pull this leg up out. But you do still have to be careful. Like I say, sometimes these legs come down and they got kind of a little dog leg the way they've bent them, and if it hangs onto that solder pad and you end up pushing back down on it, or even if you pull up in the wrong way, you can damage the solder pad and make it come loose from the chassis, and you don't want to make that lift. But we'll get it molten and try to pull up on it a little bit. Oh, it fell right out. So my fingers lost grip, but you see the capacitor actually just fell right out. I didn't put much force on it at all. And one hole has actually pretty much cleared itself. This one I need to come back with some desoldering braid or a solder sucker. I'll probably use a desoldering braid, just clean some of this old solder off, touch that just a little bit, and we'll put the new capacitor in place, and we'll start putting new solder on it and get it in place. But let's find our old capacitor here that dropped. Okay, if I can get in camera, there's our old capacitor, and if you can see what I mean about the legs on these, sometimes they get kind of a little dog-eared effect to them. The way they install them, I don't know exactly how they go in at the factory, but those bends right there, they can make it hard to get it out of the holes for these smaller ones. And what it is they do that because the holes on the chassis itself are separated further apart than the legs on the actual capacitor. I'll show you the, let's see, replacement capacitor is a 1UF 250 volt. Let's see, 250 volt. Make sure I find it in my little collection of capacitors here. 1UF 250 volt. Pull it off my styrofoam. Here's our new one that's going in. I'm not sure if you can read it or not, but it's 1UF 250 volt, and that's going to replace one of the exact same value. But so you can see how a brand new one, the legs are just pretty much straight, and to go down in the holes on this other side of the chassis, sometimes the holes are separated by more than that distance. So at the factory somehow they have something that bends those to go down in there and solders them in. I don't know if it's a machine, I'm not sure how they do it, but right now we'd want to make sure that we orient this correctly. Just looking right now, I can't tell exactly which side would be negative from this side, but I can show you a quick way to check. If you have a multimeter, I have one here off camera that you can't see, but I'll show you. It's an old Radio Shack model that I've had for a long time. See if I can get it in front of the camera. This is just a Radio Shack multimeter. Let me back up on the zoom here. It's a little Radio Shack pocket multimeter. I've had it forever, and I would just turn it on and set it to continuity up here. And on continuity, if you touch the probes together, it makes a beeping sound and it reads like a short. And you can check to see if a circuit is complete between one component and another, or if 2 points are shorted together somehow. And what you can do actually from the bottom, if you knew this was the 2 points for where the capacitor was connected, you can actually just touch the probe to one of the connections and then find a place that you know is a ground on the chassis. And up here near the top, let me see if I can zoom out a little more for you. Up here near the top, like we know this right here, there's a heat sink mounted into this place. Anywhere you see a heat sink extending through the chassis and it's soldered in place, one of these large places like this, that's always going to be a ground. So you can actually see which one of these pads on the bottom is shorted to ground, and that'll tell you which is the negative side of the capacitor. Now see, that side right there, left, that's negative. This side does nothing. So this is positive. It continues on with the circuit with some other things. That's shorted. Anything in this dark green area, that's going to be shorted to ground. So that's a ground off of other components. And this is a positive that's continued on in the circuit with some other components down through here. But you can check, just make sure you still have continuity. If you're afraid that you damage the solder pad, you can touch it there. If I can hold my hand steady. Move on down, follow this dark green. And you still got continuity, so there's nothing wrong. The solder pad's still making good connection. And we're going to go ahead and clear this up a little bit and clear this with some desoldering braid. What I like to do, this is easy for me. A lot of people just sit here and hold this straight off of desoldering braid roll. I actually take and cut me maybe about an inch or so off. Use my nippers, cut me about an inch or so. And I take some needle nose pliers and hold it good and firm where there's maybe about a half an inch or a little less sticking off. And it's just easier for me to handle that way. And I'll zoom back in and just show you what I'm doing here. Wish this camera would focus a little closer. It's the solder points. They got a shininess to it and it makes it hard for the camera to focus. But I think we got it pretty good there where you can see what I'm doing. And I just make sure that you got the chassis supported, whatever configuration you have it in. Lay it up against there and heat up the braid and then pull it away, and it takes a good bit of solder with it. Sometimes you have to repeat the process if it fills up with solder. Got most of it. There it is, it's pretty clear. If there's any kind of runs off the edge of the solder pad, just kind of make it molten with your soldering iron and get it to touch the pad again so it's not running off and causing like a short between there and the next point. Probably need to clean the tip on my soldering iron a little bit. It's not heating up as well as I'd like. But we pretty much got that hole clear. Now this one's about clear, but we're going to clean a little bit more of that solder off. So we take our desoldering braid and lay it against there on a part that's relatively clean and free of solder. Melt that down on there and pull it away. And we've taken most of the solder off, so we've cleared those 2 points pretty good. We've got the majority of the old solder off, so we can flow some new fresh solder on there. First thing we want to do is take our capacitor and get it in place. And remember, from the test a minute ago, the left hand side was the negative and this was a positive. I'm going to go ahead and put this in place on the other side, extend it through the holes, if I can do so blindly. Well, can't hardly see. I'm gonna have to lean over my chassis here. Okay, so now you can see I've got the legs extended through, and I did double check on the other side as I leaned over, and this is my negative side, so you can compare it and make sure that your stripe, it has the negative symbol on the capacitor, is on the side that is screen printed on the other side showing the negative. And make sure when you take your capacitor out that the way you take the capacitor out, the marking that shows negative on the capacitor is lined up with the screen printing on the chassis that shows negative, because sometimes they're wrong and they know that at the factory, so they install the capacitor correctly but the screen printing is still, you know, incorrect. So just watch your capacitors and put them back in like the old capacitors are if the chassis was working properly. If it wasn't working properly and that's a suspect capacitor that you think might have been in improperly, then you know, you might want to do some double checkings on a schematic or ask other people who have an identical chassis if that's the way that capacitor is oriented for that specific location. Like this one would be location C716. Okay, now we're going to try to flow some new solder on here. And sometimes if the capacitor is not holding itself in position perfectly like you like on the other side, you might have to somehow, you know, solder one leg and get it steady in position and then reach around with your hand and hold it. What I do is I take and push the capacitor down about where I want it, and I'll take and bend one leg one way and one leg kind of the opposite direction, and it just kind of helps hold it in place. And then you can go ahead and solder. And as you do it, try to work kind of quickly. Try not to keep the heat on top of the solder pad for a real long time, and know that if you keep it on the solder for a long time, it'll actually, it's like it burns up the flux, and it kind of makes a cold looking solder joint. You want it to look kind of shiny if you can. So don't be afraid to kind of, you know, push some solder on there to get some new solder to go and flow on it. When you pull your hot iron away, sometimes it's best to pull the point of your hot iron up the leg of the capacitor, so any excess solder will just run up the leg of the capacitor instead of gooping up and hanging down to another point or something like that. Need just a touch more on that one. And you see the way I rake the point back up the leg of the capacitor, just any of it that might have been like a little blob that wanted to run or drip, instead of pulling it off down near the bottom and making like a point and then clipping this leg off and it's like you got 2 points sticking off, just pull it up the leg of the capacitor and any of that molten stuff will just follow the leg of the capacitor out. Then when you clip it off, it'll be gone. So there's both of them. Doesn't take very long if your soldering iron's pretty hot. But like I say, you just don't want to hold it to the point too long, because if you do, it can, you know, excess heat will start making those pads lift away from the board. So let's take a look at the other side for a second. I'm kind of zoomed in there. See, right here's our capacitor. You can see the legs extending down through there. So we haven't clipped those off yet, but it's not all the way flush down. Like I say, these small ones, they're kind of hard to get flush all the way down. They're going to stick up a little bit, but I just try to get them, you know, not sticking up excessively high. We're going to come back and trim off our legs. And sometimes at this point too, what I'll do is I do have a magnifying glass, and as I'm getting older, magnifying glass really helps. I don't know if it's going to focus on this video, it might, but you can kind of see there the legs of the capacitor that I soldered, and it'll just help you look a little closer and see if, you know, your solder looks like it flowed good on the legs. I'm looking at it right now, looks really good on the right leg. Left leg looks pretty good too. Reasonably satisfied with that. Like I say, looking through the video camera, you probably can't see that too good. But helps me a lot, you know. And make sure you got some good light so you can take a look. Clip these legs off, and sometimes you can leave the legs on for just a second. Take you like a multimeter, set it to the continuity mode, and touch it to the end of the leg somewhere at the end of the leg, and then follow that circuit down. You know, this circuit continues in the green area. We'll follow it all the way down to this point, and we'll just, let's see, let me zoom out so you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, this circuit where this is soldered into, it goes all the way down to like a point here, and it follows all the way down to a point here. I just take it all the way down to a point that's farthest away, touch one end of the multimeter, then touch the other end to the capacitor leg, and you see you're getting continuity. So you know you got this soldered in good enough that it's getting continuity. And I mean, especially if you're testing from the end of the capacitor leg, you know that your connection's good. You don't have a problem. And I could have done it on this other one before I clipped it off, but you can do it after you clip them off. Just make sure that you're getting continuity to the other points, and you know you've probably made a pretty good connection. Go ahead and clip our other capacitor leg off. And it went flying across the kitchen. But I'll pick that up in a minute. So we got both of them clipped off there. And like I say, I just take my magnifying glass, just check it out by hand there, and make sure, to my eyes, it looks like everything flowed really well. And that's the last capacitor for the chassis. Okay, now we're going to work on the neck board capacitors. Have the neck board right here. This shouldn't really take too awful long, and most of these are smaller capacitors. A little bit easier to work on a neck board since it's such a small circuit board. But I'm going to be replacing this capacitor, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and a little bit larger one right there. And that's all that's included in the kit. Now there is, however, one other capacitor there, but it looks like either it was added on at the factory or it was something added on as some type of modification or something later, because it's hooked in with a leg of a transistor and a wire that's shortened two connections there, and it's not actually marked on the neck board as being a location for a capacitor. Now if I end up doing all the rest of these and I do have one that's that value left over, then I can go ahead and replace it. It's a 4.7 UF, let's see, I saw it a minute ago, 4.7 UF 50 volt, and I haven't took a look over here. Let me just peek at the capacitors that are left over. 4.7 UF. I've got a 4.7 UF 50 volt and a 4.7 UF 250 volt. So I do have one that's compatible, but I'm afraid one of the other caps are probably going to take it. Let me look and see. Yeah, 4.7 UF 50 volt at location C519. Yeah, this location right here has the same value capacitor, and I think that's the only one like that that I have left. So unless I can find one somewhere in some parts that I've got, then that one right there may not be changed out. But it looks like it was just added on later. It might have been part of an update or something, because this board, the chassis at least, has had 3 updates to it. So there might have been an update to this neck board or something that a technician added there and they thought it was needed. But other than that one cap, the rest of them will get replaced. And we're going to check continuity back here where it looks real dark. That's where the legs of the transistors for the colors are soldered in. You know, I showed you that some of these traces are lifting here. I'll show you again. I think you have already seen that. But some of these traces here, you can see right over there is lifting up from the circuit board there. And that happens because these produce so much heat, and it will lift the traces and all. But if you go messing with them, if the continuity is good, sometimes you can make them worse. So I want to check and make sure the continuity is good with the rest of the circuit and all, and that the solder joints look good. And if they do, I'm not really going to muck with it much, because the transistors, from what I know from the owner, they're working and he has all his colors. So I'm going to get to work on this and come back and show you some of the results. Just want to show you guys, I just removed a 1UF 50 volt capacitor from location C512. If you see there C512, it's right below C506 and I think that's, I'm not even sure if it's 506 and 518. I have to take a look. C508 and C513. So location C512. Just wanted to show you guys that unlike like this capacitor right here, see the marking underneath. I bent it to the side slightly. Usually it would sit up, but I'm about to replace that one, so it doesn't matter that I'm kind of bending the legs a little bit. But anyway, usually you have a circle underneath, and denoting the negative side will be half the circle is filled in dark, like black, and the other half is open, so that's your positive side. And if you see on this capacitor here, there's your stripe denoting negative. Get in a little bit closer so you can see that really well. And that's the way a normal capacitor should be set and oriented, but on that one right there at C512, right in the middle of these two small, I think these are considered mylar capacitors. It says C512. C always denotes a capacitor, but there's no screen printing there to denote a capacitor goes there, and it doesn't tell you which side's negative or positive. So you have to look at the capacitor you take out, because that small capacitor I just showed you was installed in that area, and it is called for being replaced in Bob Roberts cap kit with the same value. Almost all the other ones, like I just installed 3 in a row right there, they were all identicals, and all of them had the screen printing underneath them, just like that larger capacitor there. But just wanted to show you that sometimes there is capacitors installed and there's no markings to tell you how to put them back in. So if you're replacing them, make sure you put them back in the way the original ones were. And just like this one here, there's nothing under there denoting that a capacitor even supposed to be there. It's tapped into one leg of this transistor here, and then this wire that shorts a circuit to another part of a circuit there. It's just installed there. So if you wanted to replace this, you'd have to make sure you see that the negative stripe up here is on this side and not on this other side. So when you take the capacitor out and put a new one in, you don't put it in backwards. Okay guys, we're all done with the capacitors on the neck board, so that takes care of all of our capacitors. We got all of them done for the chassis, have all of them done for the neck board. The only thing left to do is put the Flyback, the new Flyback on the chassis. I waited to do it till last because it was a lot easier not to install it while I was flipping the chassis out and back and working on those capacitors. But we actually have a good bit of capacitors left over. This is our styrofoam that we started out with, and they were somewhere around 40 or so capacitors, I can't remember, something like that, maybe 40 something, and we actually end up with a total of 11 with this non-polarized or bipolar cap that we didn't use. It's made only to be used with a K7400 or K7500, and all these were mostly for the K7400, K7500. There may have been one or two there that was a different one for the U5000, and since this is a U5000, we didn't need any of these. So these are just brand new caps that are left over. The owner can keep them and you know, store them in case he needs them later for another project or something like that, or he has a cap fail. But just show you real quick. There is all of our new caps that we've got installed there. Different colors. We've got green, black. I think there was one dark blue one right there. Most of them are like green, kind of a mint green. And we got some black ones here and here. Well, that's the original one that we did not replace, and a dark blue one there. But all went in pretty good. Didn't have too much trouble out of them. Right now, I am a little worried about these color transistors. I'm going to check the other side right now for continuity on those traces. If you remember, I showed you in an earlier clip the traces on this for the color transistors. They get damaged really easy because those color transistors get really hot. Even though they have some small heat sinks installed on there, they generate a lot of heat, and these look to be the original transistors that are in there. The owner acted like all three colors are working. I don't think there's a problem with that. But what we're going to do, I'll zoom in right here and just let you see me while I'm working on the transistor solder side. And I'll just point out to you our points of interest are this solder pad here, here, and here. That's for the first color transistor. Ignore these two. I think that's for a resistor in between them. Here, here, and here is for the next color transistor. Here and here we're going to ignore because that's for a resistor. And then here, here, and here is for the last color transistor. And some of these pads are lifting. That one's lifting. That one's lifting. I think that one. That one's lifting. I think that one too. But they still have connections, and the traces don't look broken. They just look like they're lifting. So we're going to use the multimeter, set it to continuity. Got our multimeter working, and what we're going to do is just touch one probe to one point where the leg is extending down from the transistor on the other side, and we're going to follow the trace back to another solder point. And we got a beep, so we know that that's got good continuity through that whole trace down to the next point. We're going to go up to the next one, touch our probe, follow this down until we get to the next point. And it's working fine. It's just sometimes you got to kind of wiggle the tip of the probe. Okay, the last one for that color transistor. And you can even check this one up here. There's another point. So it's got good continuity. That's the first color transistor. Let's go to the second one. No problem. The next lead on the second one. No problem. Third lead on the second one. We can go back up and check on this point. Okay, that's our second transistor. Now the last transistor. No problem. No problem. Final lead on that last transistor. And we'll check it up here at this point. So we got good continuity on all those legs, so that means the color transistors are soldered in okay. I've checked the joints and they don't look like cold solder joints. They look like they're good and intact. We just have some lifting of the traces. So I want to leave that alone. I'm not going to try to mess with it because more heat is just going to damage it more. So he's just going to try to get as much life out of this as he can. Got all his capacitors done. We'll have to, you'll notice I just went ahead and clipped this G2 wire right here and cut it off of the old flyback transformer. And right here is your focus wire. And your focus wire goes down right here to where your socket is for your tube, your CRT, and there's a couple of clips that you can take loose on each side and it'll open this whole thing up. On this particular model, you might be able to see right here, you can actually release this clip. I've actually released it some, but when you release this, it takes tension off of a metal clip down inside there, and it allows you to pull this wire straight out. So you can actually take that wire straight out, but we want to replace this entire wire. This is just the old focus wire off the old flyback transformer, and the new wire, the new focus wire off the flyback transformer, I'll have to strip it back a little bit and insert it down into here. You push it down in firmly, and then you close this, and when it clips shut, it clamps down on that wire, and that wire doesn't move. It doesn't come out. So that's what we're going to do with the new one. And this right here may actually take this connector off the end of the G2 wire and solder it or affix it to the new G2 wire because it doesn't have that connector on the end. And this goes to a pin here. It actually plugs on. If I can't get that to work, I may have to desolder the pin and solder the G2 wire directly to the neck board. But that'll be in the next clips when we're doing the flyback transformer. And pretty much our neck board, besides doing those couple of things, is ready to go, and the chassis is ready except for the flyback transformer. Okay guys, we're going to make our connections from our new flyback to our neck board, and I think I showed you in an earlier clip. Here's the old focus wire, and if you pretend it's still connected to the old flyback, I just chopped them off because it's going to be tossed out. The other end of the focus wire, this is the focus wire, goes down into the socket, and some of them, I have heard some people say that you can't get it out. You can just pull it out and cram a new one in there. Most of them I've seen, you can actually undo a couple of clips on each side and pull up. Well, this has got a big clip over here, and you can open the entire thing up. Or if you just want to get to the focus wire, there's a small clip right here on the side, and I've already kind of released it, and you have to use like a small flat bladed screwdriver or something, kind of carefully pry and kind of pop that loose from a tab it clicks onto, and then just raise this up, and this little piece of plastic right here goes down into a slot. There's a slot down in there, and when it goes down in there, it acts like a wedge. It goes in there and it wedges against a metal clip. There's a metal clip down in that little slot that makes contact with the side of the focus wire when it's in there. Now, if this is not closed, it's not wedged against it, it's not quite as tight, so you can actually pull the focus wire out. It's still pretty snug actually, but you can see where the focus wire has been in there for an eternity, how clean it looks right here, and then it's awful dirty on past there. But it's been stuck down in there for years and years, and they've got this stripped back maybe about a little less than half an inch maybe. And the new Flyback, I actually thought I was going to have to strip it, but looking on here, it's actually pre-stripped and pre-tinned, and it looks like it is the exact depth that I need, so I'm just not going to bother with stripping it myself. I'm going to trust them. They don't like they've hurt the wire or damaged it or anything from the factory that made it. So anyway, that's exactly like I need to put back in here. And before I do that, I've got to do the G2 wire here. This is the thinner wire, at least the insulation is thinner. And earlier I said I couldn't find a voltage rating on it, and I still can't quite find a voltage rating on it, but I did find a voltage rating on the new Flyback. That was probably what I was talking about. The new Flyback, I had to look with a magnifying glass, but it has 1.2 thousand volts DC rating on this wire, and it's the same gauge. It's 22 AWG as the gauge wire in the focus wire. It's 22 AWG. It's just got kind of a double shielding. It's a lot thicker. You can see just by looking right there, the white wire. It's a whole lot thicker. It's just got a lot more insulation because it can carry up to 20,000 volts on it. But they're really, I don't know if you can see without me zooming in, but the end of the wire where it's stripped is practically the same gauge, 22 AWG. But what we're going to do here, if you can look on the neck board, this old G2 wire that we cut off of the old Flyback, it just plugs on. You got a single pin header there, and there's some hot melt glue that's on there, but it's already been broken loose. Somebody must have disconnected it before, and you can just pull that loose from the pin, and that pin is soldered in. Now what we could do is just take the pre-stripped G2 wire that's on the new Flyback here, and we could just solder it straight to the board by desoldering this pin connector here, this little pin header. And you would just go on the back, let's see, right here, there's a leg from a resistor right beside it, but you would carefully desolder right there and use a pair of needle nose pliers as you were removing the solder or melting the solder, and pull the pin up from the top of the circuit board, the component side, and remove the pin, and then reinsert the new G2 wire and solder it in. But the advantage to leaving the pin and transferring this connector to the new G2 wire is that anytime this neck board is being removed from the CRT and it's being laid aside or worked on, different things like that, on and off, these wires get pulled a lot, and they tend to fray, crack, and break at the solder connections because they have no flexibility there. They're soldered directly in, and if you just leave them in place on the monitor all the time, it's not a problem. But if you take it loose constantly, or you're working on stuff, changing stuff out, every time you take it loose from the CRT and set it aside or move it around, move the chassis around and keep moving the neck board around, you start cracking that connection where it's soldered in, and it can start fraying and cause problems. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to, I don't think I have a small enough tool to get in there. If you can, on the end of there, I believe there's a place that you could slide a very small fine tool, and you can actually release this from the inside of this connection, and there's probably a metal piece that is soldered directly onto this wire, and you could take it off the wire and solder it onto the new wire and then reinsert it into this connector. Well, I don't think I have a tool quite small enough to get down in there. I'm not sure if you could do it with a very small paper clip or not, but instead of trying to monkey with that, this is the exact same 22 AWG wire, rated at the same voltage as the new one, and pretty pretty much the same, just an older piece of wire. I'm just going to come down maybe 2 or 3 inches and cut the wire and strip it and solder it back together. And before I do that, if you can see on the end of this old wire here, I've got a little sleeve of heat shrink tubing. And you can buy heat shrink tubing at electronic supply place or Radio Shack. I've got a pack here that came from Radio Shack. I've probably had it forever. I haven't used a whole lot out of it, but it comes in multiple sizes. Sometimes you can get a whole pack that's a single size. But I had multiple sizes in there, and I just happened to have a piece that I'd used on another project that looks like it's just about what I need. Probably don't even need quite that length, but I want to go slightly overkill, make sure it overlaps the soldered connection. And we're going to solder those 2 wires together. And when we're done, you know, it'll probably look like you just see just slightly a little bit of the old wire sticking up. It'll add a couple of inches, and I'll have that over the new connection. So you'll have one little place that looks a little bit more like factory. You can tell that it's been spliced, but we'll put that on there first. We actually slide it down, cut this wire, and skin back or trim the shielding or the insulation off, and solder to this, and try not to make a big clumpy solder mess, just something very fine, but you know, a good connection. And then pull the heat shrink tubing over the connection, and I'm just going to use a hair dryer. I'm just going to take the chassis in the bathroom and use the hair dryer and just run it over that a few times, and it should draw that heat shrink tubing closed over the connection, and it will look nice and factory when we're done. And I'm going to go ahead and do probably most of that off camera, but what we also got to do with our chassis here is he wanted this set to 15 kilohertz standard resolution, so I've already moved the jumper. If you can see here, you can see the pin header for medium resolution that it was on. I've already moved the jumper to the standard resolution side, and his little he's got, let me back up on the zoom here, he's got a partial kit right here installed that was an update to this chassis to fix some problems. And you have to make a change to this. It's a resistor on the little strip board here and some wires. 2 of the wires are soldered permanently in the board, but one of them is on a double pin header down here, right here, this double pin header. And there's really only 1 wire connected in it. You see a little stub of a black wire, but it doesn't go to anything. And the second part of the connector has a white wire inserted that comes off of this terminal strip with the resistor. And right now, the way it's placed, it's on a single pin that comes out of the chassis board there, and it's plugged on to where the little snub of black wires down in there. So it's actually not doing anything. It's just holding it in place. And somebody has some hot melted glue on there. Well, that's the way it was made to be set up for 25 kilohertz or medium resolution. If you want to run the chassis in the 15 kilohertz standard res mode, you have to pull this up off of that pin and set it down in such a way that the white wire is making contact with that pin there. So I'm going to have to either melt or cut off this old hot melt glue and move this pin header over. Just move it over 1, and then the combination of that and the jumper that we've changed, it'll be ready for 15 kilohertz operation. So I'm going to go ahead and start making some of these connections and fixing our stuff for our neck board, and I'll come back in a minute and show you some of the stuff I've done. Okay guys, we've got our wires soldered together there. I tried to make sure that the solder flowed all the way across and around both sides, and you don't want to get it too hot because you can melt this insulation, but it's a good strong connection. I don't feel like there's any problems with that, and I kept it small enough to where the bulk of the solder is not any wider than the insulation of the wire. It's similar, and you can just slide your heat shrink tubing up over that connection and overlap it pretty evenly on both sides. And then I'll go take this to the next room and I'll put a hair dryer on it for a minute, and it will tighten that up really tight on that wire. You want to use a piece of heat shrink tubing that's loose enough to slide comfortably out back the wire, because in case you do get the solder connection a little bit fat, you don't want to sit there and have to push and push and push on it to try to get it to go across. You could damage the solder connection you just made. You want it to be just a little bit loose, because it'll shrink up, you know, maybe not half its original size, but a good bit. And we'll take this to the next room and I'll come back and show you after I shrink it up. Okay guys, got the heat shrink tubing shrunk down around the wire, and I don't know how closely you can see there, but worked out really nice. It shrinks down and really covers the connection good. It's a lot better than electrical tape. You get a really good tight fit, and it's just about as good as the insulation that's around the rest of the wire. Looks a lot better than electrical tape or anything like that too. And don't ever have to worry about anything, you know, accidentally coming in contact with your connection, and it helps protect the connection that you've soldered also. Doesn't snag on anything. But we got that done, so that's ready to just plug on the neck board. And I cut it such a length that it kind of evened up the focus wire and this wire, because before that the focus wire was a bit longer. Let's see now. Actually now they come out to about like that, so the G2 is a little bit longer now, but they're pretty close where they connect on the neck board. They're not too awful far. This connects basically right on the socket, and this is just a small ways away. But I want to scrape a little bit of this glue off. Might be able to just take it off with my finger. Just get some of that off because it just looks gunky on there. But I'm going to finish doing that off camera, and I'll connect the focus wire here in just a second.